Hi, I'm Diane Hartley. I thought survival meant keeping your head down, stretching every dollar until it screamed, and never expecting anything good to walk through your door. For years, that's exactly how I lived. Waiting tables at a diner where the coffee was always burnt and the tips were always thin. Counting loose change on my kitchen counter just to afford ramen and eggs. Wondering if this month would be the month I couldn't make rent. And then one gray Tuesday morning, while I was separating quarters from dimes in my apartment that smelled like mildew and yesterday's desperation, my phone rang. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. A voice I didn't recognize said 6 words that split my life clean in half. Ms. Hartley, you're our majority shareholder. I thought it was a scam. I thought it was a mistake. I thought it was anything except what it actually was. The truth. A truth that had been buried for 30 years under family secrets, corporate paperwork, and the kind of silence that only money can buy. The rain hadn't stopped in 4 days. Not the romantic kind you see in movies, but the relentless, dreary type that turns Bellmont, Oregon into a study in gray. Asphalt gray. Sky gray. The kind of gray that seeps into your bones and makes you forget what warmth feels like. I stood at the grimy window of my studio apartment on Maple Grove Avenue, watching water streak down the glass in crooked rivers, distorting the streetlights below into blurry halos. My breath fogged the pane as I pressed my forehead against it, feeling the cold bite through my skin. Behind me, spread across the kitchen counter like evidence of a crime, was $3.47 in assorted change. I'd already sorted it twice. Checked under the couch cushions. Dug through my jacket pockets. Searched the cup holder in my car. This was it. This was what stood between me and hunger until Friday when my paycheck from Riverside Diner would finally hit my account. 2 more days. 48 hours. I could make it work. I always did. The apartment was small enough that I could see everything from where I stood. The futon that doubled as my bed, sagging in the middle from years of use before it ever got to me. The card table I'd found on the curb that served as both dining surface and desk. The mini fridge that hummed too loudly and sometimes stopped working altogether until you kicked it just right. The walls were that particular shade of off-white that comes from decades of different tenants and landlords who didn't care enough to repaint properly. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling in the corner above the bathroom, rust-colored and spreading like a slow infection. I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. The heater in this place was a lie. It clanked and groaned and occasionally blew lukewarm air that smelled vaguely of burning dust, but it never actually warmed anything. I'd learned to layer. Thermal shirt, sweater, cardigan, and on really cold nights, I slept in my winter coat. Pride was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. My phone sat on the counter next to the pile of coins, screen dark and silent. I'd been rationing my data plan, only turning it on when absolutely necessary. Wi-Fi was a fantasy. The coffee shop down the street had a connection, but you had to buy something to use it, and buying something meant spending money I didn't have. So mostly, I lived in a strange analog silence, disconnected from the world in ways that felt both freeing and suffocating. I picked up a quarter, turned it over in my fingers. It was dated 1993. The year I was born. The year my mother died. The year my grandfather, Vincent Hartley, a man I'd never met and barely knew existed, apparently decided I wasn't worth acknowledging. I'd pieced together fragments of his story over the years from my father's bitter, drunken rants before he'd overdosed when I was 16. Vincent had been successful. Had money. Had a company. Had a life in Portland that sparkled with the kind of privilege that people like us could only imagine from a distance. He'd also had standards. And my mother, pregnant and unmarried at 22, working at a gas station and dating a mechanic with a gambling problem, didn't meet them. So he'd cut her off. Completely. Refused her calls. Sent back her letters. Let her struggle and scrape and eventually collapse from an undiagnosed heart condition in an emergency room waiting room because she didn't have insurance and had waited too long to seek help, convinced she couldn't afford to be sick. I'd grown up on the stories. My father had wielded them like weapons, using Vincent Hartley's cruelty as justification for every failure, every bottle, every time he chose oblivion over responsibility. And when he died, leaving me 17 and alone, those stories were all I had left. Stories and anger and a bone-deep certainty that people with money were fundamentally different. Fundamentally cruel. I dropped the quarter back onto the pile and walked to the bathroom. The mirror above the sink was cracked diagonally from corner to corner, a fracture line that split my reflection into mismatched halves. I looked at myself. Really looked. 30 years old, though some days I felt ancient. Brown hair pulled into a ponytail so tight it gave me headaches because it was easier than washing it every day when hot water was uncertain. Dark circles under hazel eyes that used to be brighter, back when I still thought things might get better. Skin pale from too many double shifts under fluorescent lights and not enough sunlight, not enough vegetables, not enough of anything that costs more than $1. I was thin. Not the fashionable kind. The kind that comes from skipping meals and pretending you're not hungry. My uniform from the diner hung on me like a borrowed costume. Black pants that were worn shiny at the knees. White button-down shirt that I washed by hand in the sink because the laundromat was $6 a load. Non-slip shoes that had given me blisters for the first 3 months until my feet finally surrendered and formed calluses thick enough to endure. The shower was running cold again. I twisted the knob as far as it would go, waited 30 seconds, then gave up. Cold shower it was. I stripped quickly, gasping as the icy water hit my skin, and forced myself to stand under the spray long enough to soap up and rinse off. My teeth were chattering by the time I stepped out, grabbing the threadbare towel that barely covered me and had long since lost any softness it might have once possessed. Getting dressed was a calculated routine. Cleanest underwear. The bra that didn't have a broken underwire. Thermal layer. Uniform. The cardigan over top because the diner's heating was just as unreliable as my apartment's. I pulled my hair back again, tighter this time, and skipped makeup because I didn't have any that wasn't expired or down to the very last scraping. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and exactly $1 in quarters. Enough for a small coffee at the diner before my shift started. Employee discount made it 75 cents, which meant I'd have a quarter left over. For what, I didn't know. Emergency, maybe. Though I'd learned that emergencies didn't care about quarters. The hallway outside my apartment smelled like cigarettes and boiled cabbage. Mrs. Kowalski in Unit 3 was cooking again, filling the entire second floor with the smell of her childhood in Warsaw and everyone else's nausea. I nodded to her as I passed, and she grunted something that might have been a greeting or might have been a curse. With Mrs. Kowalski, it was hard to tell. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step announcing my descent to anyone who cared to listen. The front door stuck, as always, and I had to shoulder it open, nearly stumbling onto the wet sidewalk when it finally gave way. The rain hit me immediately, soaking through my cardigan within seconds. I'd lost my umbrella 3 weeks ago, left it on the bus, and couldn't justify the $12 for a new one when I could just get wet for free. My car was parked half a block down, tucked between a pickup truck with a tarp over the bed and a sedan that hadn't moved in weeks. The 1998 Honda Civic was rusted along the wheel wells and the passenger side door didn't open from the outside anymore, but it ran. Mostly. The engine turned over on the third try, coughing and sputtering before finally catching. The heater blew cold air that would eventually turn lukewarm somewhere around the 15-minute mark. I didn't have 15 minutes. I drove through Bellmont with the windshield wipers on high, watching the town slide past in blurred streaks. Boarded up storefronts. Pawn shops. Payday loan places with neon signs promising fast cash and charging interest rates that should have been criminal. The grocery store where everything cost 20% more than it did in Portland, but nobody here had the gas money to drive 45 minutes each way for cheaper milk. The elementary school with its chain-link fence and cracked basketball court. The park where the swings had been removed years ago and never replaced. Bellmont wasn't a town that thrived. It was a town that persisted. People here didn't dream big. They dreamed small. Dreamed of making rent. Dreamed of full tanks of gas. Dreamed of a month where nothing broke down, nothing went wrong, nothing required money they didn't have. I fit right in. Riverside Diner sat on the edge of town, literally on the bank of the Clackamas River, though calling it Riverside was generous. The river was brown and sluggish, choked with debris and runoff from upstream. The diner itself was a relic from the 1960s, all faded chrome and cracked red vinyl booths. The sign out front had been missing the E in Riverside for going on 3 years. Everyone just called it the diner, like it was the only one in the world. For most of us, it might as well have been. I parked in the employee spot near the dumpster, which overflowed with trash bags. The owner, Gary, was too cheap to have picked up more than once a week. The smell was worse in summer, but even now, in the cold wet of March, it was unpleasant. I locked the car out of habit, even though there was nothing inside worth stealing, and jogged through the rain to the back entrance. The kitchen was already loud. Pans clattering. The grill hissing. Luis, the line cook, swearing in rapid Spanish at something that had burned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The air was thick with grease and the yeasty smell of the bread Luis baked fresh every morning because Gary was too cheap to buy it from a distributor. I grabbed my apron from the hook, tied it around my waist, and checked the schedule taped to the wall. 7 to 3. 8-hour shift. If it was busy, I might clear $60 in tips. If it wasn't, I'd be lucky to make 30. Krista was already working the floor, her blonde hair pulled into a high ponytail that bounced when she walked. She spotted me and grinned, waving me over to the coffee station. Krista had been my roommate 2 years ago, back when I could still afford to split an apartment with someone. She'd moved in with her boyfriend last summer, but we'd stayed close. She was the closest thing to family I had left. "You look like death," she said cheerfully, pouring me a cup of coffee without asking. "Drink this. You need it more than the customers." I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into my frozen fingers. "Thanks. Rough morning." She leaned against the counter, lowering her voice. "You eating enough?" "Because I've got leftovers from last night. Tyler made way too much pasta and I'm not gonna finish it." "I'm fine," I said automatically. The lie tasted familiar, worn smooth from repetition. Krista gave me a look that said she didn't believe me but wasn't going to push. "Not here. Not now." Instead, she bumped my shoulder with hers. Table 4 just sat down. Older couple. They tip decent. "You want it?" "Yeah. Thanks." The shift blurred into the usual rhythm. Take orders. Deliver food. Refill coffee. Smile even when customers snapped their fingers at you like you were a dog. Pretend you didn't notice when they left a $1 tip on a $30 check. My feet ached within the first hour, a familiar throb that would build into a scream by the end of the day. The coffee helped. The small breakfast Luis snuck me during a lull helped more. Scrambled eggs and toast, eaten standing up in the kitchen while Gary wasn't looking. By noon, the lunch rush hit. The diner filled with construction workers, truckers, a few office workers from the county building down the road. I moved between tables on autopilot, my mind elsewhere. Calculating. Always calculating. $3.47 plus whatever I made today minus gas to get home minus the 75 cents for coffee I'd already spent. If I could clear 40 in tips, I could buy a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a dozen eggs. That would get me through to Friday. I was refilling water glasses at table 7 when my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. I ignored it. No personal calls during shifts. Gary's rule. But it buzzed again. And again. Insistent. Urgent. Krista caught my eye from across the room, gesturing toward the back. "Go. I'll cover." I slipped into the narrow hallway between the kitchen and the bathrooms, pulling out my phone. 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. Portland area code. Probably a telemarketer. Or a debt collector. I had a few of those. I was about to shove the phone back into my pocket when it rang again. Same number. Something made me answer. Hello? The voice on the other end was male, professional, carefully neutral. Ms. Hartley? Diane Hartley? Yeah. Who's this? My name is Leonard Voss. I'm an attorney with Whitfield and Associates in Portland. I've been trying to reach you for several days. Do you have a moment to speak privately? My stomach dropped. Attorneys meant trouble. Meant debt. Meant someone was coming after me for money I didn't have. I pressed my back against the wall, suddenly dizzy. Look, if this is about medical bills or something, I'm already on a payment plan. I can't, Ms. Hartley, please. This isn't about debt. This concerns your grandfather, Vincent Hartley. I went very still. Vincent. The grandfather who'd abandoned my mother. Who'd let her die rather than acknowledge her existence. Who'd built an empire in Portland while we'd starved in Bellmont. I don't have a grandfather. He made that pretty clear. Leonard Voss cleared his throat. I understand there was estrangement. However, Mr. Hartley passed away 6 weeks ago. I'm the executor of his estate. And according to his will, you are named as the primary beneficiary. The hallway tilted. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process words that didn't make sense. What? Mr. Hartley left you a substantial inheritance, Miss Hartley. As well as a controlling stake in Hartley Industries. 51% of company shares. You are, effectively, the majority shareholder of a $340 million corporation. The phone slipped from my hand. I stared at the cracked linoleum floor, at the scuff marks and the coffee stains, and tried to breathe. From the dining room, I could hear the clatter of plates, the murmur of conversation, Krista laughing at something a customer said. Normal sounds. A normal day. Except nothing was normal. Nothing would ever be normal again. I picked up the phone. My hand was shaking. Why? Why would he do that? Leonard's voice was gentle now, almost kind. I think that's a conversation we should have in person. Can you come to Portland? Tomorrow, perhaps? I looked down at my uniform. At my water-stained shoes. At the 73 cents in tips I'd shoved into my apron pocket during the rush. Tomorrow. Portland. A different world. A world I didn't belong to. But apparently, a world that now belonged to me. Yes, I whispered. I'll be there. I drove home in a trance, the windshield wipers beating a rhythm that matched my pulse. Fast. Erratic. Disbelieving. The rain had intensified, turning the highway into a river of brake lights and spray, but I barely noticed. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice kept repeating the same question over and over. $340 million. $340 million. How do you even begin to comprehend a number like that when you've spent the last decade counting pennies? The attorney, Leonard Voss, had given me an address in downtown Portland. Whitfield and Associates, 20th floor of some building I'd probably walked past a dozen times when I used to take the bus into the city for job interviews I never got. He'd asked if 10 in the morning worked for me, as if I had a schedule to consult, as if my life was filled with appointments and obligations that mattered. I'd said yes because what else could I say? No, I need to check with my calendar full of nothing. When I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building, the Civic's engine died with a shudder that felt ominous. It had been making that sound for weeks, a death rattle I'd been ignoring because ignoring things was cheaper than fixing them. I sat there in the silence, rain drumming on the roof, and tried to organize my thoughts into something coherent. Vincent Hartley. My grandfather. A man whose name I'd heard maybe 20 times in my entire life, always wrapped in bitterness and rage. He'd abandoned my mother when she'd needed him most. Let her work herself into an early grave. Refused every attempt she'd made to reconcile. And now, 30 years later, he'd left me everything. It didn't make sense. People like Vincent Hartley didn't suddenly develop consciences on their deathbeds. They didn't hand fortunes to granddaughters they'd never met, never acknowledged, never cared about. There had to be a catch. A condition. Some twisted final act of control from beyond the grave. Maybe the inheritance came with strings. Maybe I had to change my name, denounce my mother's memory, perform some humiliating public ritual to prove I was worthy of his legacy. The scenarios spun through my head, each one darker than the last. I finally forced myself out of the car and climbed the stairs to my apartment. The building felt different now, though nothing had actually changed. The same peeling paint. The same smell of Mrs. Kowalski's cooking. The same flickering light in the second-floor hallway that the landlord refused to replace. But I saw it all through a strange new lens, like I was already separating from this life, this place, these circumstances that had defined me for so long. Inside, I dropped my keys on the counter next to the pile of change I'd left that morning. $3.47. It looked obscene now. Pathetic. Evidence of a poverty so complete that I'd been weighing coins to determine whether I could afford to eat. I swept the change into my palm and threw it in the drawer with a violence that surprised me, slamming it shut hard enough to rattle the cheap particle board cabinet. My phone buzzed. A text from Krista. "You okay? You disappeared. Gary's pissed but I covered. Call me." I stared at the message for a long moment, trying to figure out how to respond. How do you tell someone that your entire reality just shifted? That the life you were living this morning no longer exists? That you might be rich, though you don't believe it, can't believe it, won't believe it until someone puts actual money in your actual hand? I typed out 3 different responses and deleted them all before finally settling on something simple. "I'm fine. Something came up. I'll explain later." The apartment felt too small suddenly. Claustrophobic. I paced from the window to the bathroom and back, my wet shoes squeaking on the linoleum, leaving tracks. I needed to think. Needed to plan. Tomorrow I'd go to Portland, meet with Leonard Voss, and find out what this inheritance actually meant. But tonight, right now, I needed to understand how I'd ended up here. How I'd become the kind of person who counted coins for food. How 30 years had passed in a fog of survival that left me with nothing to show for it except calluses and exhaustion. I thought about my mother. Claire. I'd seen maybe a dozen photos of her, most of them damaged or faded, passed down through my father's collection of belongings that I'd inherited when he died. In every picture, she looked tired. Even the early ones, before I was born, showed a kind of weariness around her eyes. Like she'd been born knowing life was going to be hard and had simply accepted it as fact. She'd worked at a gas station on the outskirts of Bellmont, pumping fuel and selling lottery tickets and beef jerky to truckers passing through. Minimum wage. No benefits. No future. She'd gotten pregnant at 22. My father, Marcus, had been 25 and working as a mechanic at the only garage in town. They'd never married. I don't think they were ever really together in any meaningful way. Just 2 people who'd collided briefly and produced a consequence neither of them was prepared for. When my mother had called Vincent to tell him about the pregnancy, hoping for support or at least acknowledgement, he'd hung up on her. When she'd written letters, they'd come back unopened. When she'd tried to visit his office in Portland, security had escorted her out. Vincent Hartley didn't have a daughter working at a gas station. He had an image. A reputation. A business empire built on precision manufacturing and government contracts. He attended charity galas. Served on boards. Got his picture in the business section of the newspaper standing next to senators and CEOs. A pregnant daughter with no college degree and no prospects didn't fit that narrative. So she didn't exist. Simple as that. My mother had died when I was 3 months old. Heart failure. Undiagnosed condition. She'd been feeling sick for weeks but hadn't gone to the doctor because she didn't have insurance and couldn't afford the visit. By the time my father finally took her to the emergency room, it was too late. She'd collapsed in the waiting area, still holding the clipboard with the intake forms she'd been filling out. They'd tried to save her, but her heart had simply given up. 30 years old. Younger than I was now. My father had raised me alone, though raised was a generous term for what had actually happened. He'd kept me alive. Fed me. Made sure I went to school. But Marcus Hartley had been a broken man long before my mother died, and her death had simply finished the job. He'd started drinking seriously when I was 5. Gambling when I was 7. By the time I was 10, I was forging his signature on school forms and learning how to make macaroni and cheese on the stove because he'd be passed out on the couch when I got home. He'd talked about Vincent sometimes, usually when he was drunk enough that the anger overwhelmed the pain. Called him every name in the book. Blamed him for my mother's death, which wasn't entirely fair but wasn't entirely wrong either. If Vincent had helped, if he'd provided any support at all, maybe my mother would have had health insurance. Maybe she would have gone to the doctor sooner. Maybe she'd still be alive. But Vincent hadn't helped. He'd turned his back. And my father had never forgiven him for it. Never forgiven himself either, for not being enough to save her. Marcus had died when I was 16. Overdose. I'd found him in the bathroom, needle still in his arm, eyes half open and staring at nothing. The paramedics had tried to be kind about it, but there was no kind way to tell a teenager that her father had chosen oblivion over staying alive for her. I'd become a ward of the state for 2 years, bouncing between foster homes that ranged from indifferent to outright hostile. On my 18th birthday, I'd aged out of the system with $200 in savings, a duffel bag of clothes, and absolutely no plan for what came next. I'd been surviving ever since. That was the only word for it. Not living. Not thriving. Just surviving. One day at a time. One shift at a time. $1 at a time. I'd worked every minimum wage job Bellmont had to offer. Fast food. Retail. Cleaning houses. Stocking shelves at the grocery store at 4 in the morning. The diner had been the most stable gig I'd managed to hold, 3 years and counting, which felt like some kind of perverse achievement. I'd never been to college. Never learned a trade. Never developed any skills that translated into better opportunities. I'd tried, God knows I'd tried. Applied for scholarships that required essays about overcoming adversity, as if my entire life wasn't one long exercise in overcoming. Looked into vocational programs that cost money I didn't have. Thought about joining the military just for the structure and the steady paycheck, but I'd failed the physical due to chronic anemia from malnutrition. Every door I'd approached had been locked. Every ladder I'd tried to climb had been missing crucial rungs. And through it all, Vincent Hartley had been out there somewhere. Living in his mansion. Running his company. Spending money on things I couldn't even imagine while his granddaughter ate ramen and wondered if she'd make rent. He'd known I existed. Had to have known. Bellmont wasn't that big. His daughter had died here. His granddaughter was growing up here in poverty that should have been unconscionable to a man of his wealth. But he'd never reached out. Never checked. Never cared. So why now? Why leave me anything at all, let alone everything? The question gnawed at me as I finally stopped pacing and collapsed onto the futon. Maybe it was guilt. Deathbed conversion. The terror of facing whatever comes next and wanting to balance the cosmic scales. Or maybe it was strategy. Some tax dodge or legal maneuver that required an heir. Maybe I was just a convenient pawn in some game I didn't understand, and the moment I signed whatever papers Leonard Voss put in front of me, I discovered the inheritance came with conditions that made it worthless. I pulled out my phone and did something I'd been avoiding. Googled Vincent Hartley. The results were immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of articles. Photos. Obituaries that read like hagiographies. Prominent Portland businessman dies at 82. Industry leader Vincent Hartley leaves legacy of innovation. Philanthropist and entrepreneur remembered by community. The photos showed a tall man with silver hair and sharp features. Expensive suits. Confident smile. Standing in front of buildings that bore his name, shaking hands with people who looked important. I scrolled through article after article, reading about a man who seemed to exist in a completely different universe than the one I inhabited. He'd started Hartley Industries in the late 80s with a loan from his father, manufacturing specialized components for aerospace and defense contractors. The company had grown steadily over 3 decades, expanding into telecommunications and medical devices. Annual revenue in the hundreds of millions. Workforce of over 800 people. Offices in Portland, Seattle, and Los Angeles. Vincent had been married twice. His first wife, Elizabeth, had died in a car accident in 1978. They'd had 1 child together. My mother, Claire. His second wife, Patricia, was mentioned in several articles as a socialite and patron of the arts. They'd married in 1985, 7 years after Elizabeth's death. No children from that marriage. Patricia had died 3 years ago from cancer. The obituaries mentioned she'd been 68. So Vincent had spent his final years alone. No wife. No children, at least none he acknowledged. Just the company and whatever guilt or regret he'd accumulated over 8 decades of living. And in the end, he'd left it all to me. The granddaughter he'd rejected. The living reminder of the daughter he'd abandoned. It still didn't make sense. Maybe it never would. I found a photo from Vincent's funeral. It showed the entrance to a downtown Portland church, expensive cars lined up along the street, people in black designer clothing entering through ornate doors. The caption mentioned that over 300 people had attended. Business leaders, politicians, employees, friends. 300 people mourning a man I'd never met. 300 people who probably had no idea I existed. I wondered if any of them knew about the inheritance yet. If word had gotten out that some waitress from Bellmont was about to inherit everything. I imagined the shock, the outrage, the immediate scramble to contest the will. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Krista. Seriously, call me. You're freaking me out. I hit dial before I could overthink it. She answered on the first ring. What happened? Are you okay? Did Gary fire you? No. Nothing like that. I paused, trying to find words that wouldn't sound insane. I got a phone call today. From an attorney in Portland. Oh God. What kind of attorney? Are you in trouble? The opposite, actually. My grandfather died. He left me money. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, carefully, I didn't know you had a grandfather. I didn't. I mean, I knew he existed, but we never met. He cut off my mom before I was born. Never wanted anything to do with us. And now he's leaving you money? That's weird, Diane. Are you sure it's legitimate? Could be a scam. That's what I thought too. But the attorney sounded real. New details about my family. Gave me an office address. I'm supposed to go tomorrow and sign papers. How much money are we talking about? Like, enough to pay off your car? I laughed, a sharp bitter sound that startled us both. More than that. A lot more. I think he left me his company. A $340 million company. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Krista said, very quietly, holy shit. Yeah. Diane, that's insane. That's life-changing. That's. I don't even know what that is. I don't know if it's real yet. There could be conditions. Could be a mistake. Could be 100 things I'm not seeing. I'm trying not to get my hopes up. Screw that. Get your hopes up. All the way up. You deserve this. You deserve something good after everything you've been through. I felt my throat tighten. Do I? Because I'm not sure. Vincent abandoned my mom. Let her die. Never cared about me. Why would he suddenly leave me everything? Maybe he felt guilty. Maybe he regretted it. Maybe he wanted to make it right before he died. Or maybe it's one final manipulation. One last chance to control something from beyond the grave. Krista sighed. You're overthinking this. Just go to Portland tomorrow. Meet with the attorney. Find out what's real. And Diane? Whatever happens, I've got your back. You know that, right? I know. Thanks, Krista. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment and tried to imagine what tomorrow might bring. Tried to picture myself walking into a glass tower in downtown Portland, riding an elevator to the 20th floor, sitting across from an attorney who'd tell me I was rich. That I owned a company. That my life was about to change in ways I couldn't comprehend. But every time I tried to visualize it, the image dissolved. It was too foreign. Too impossible. Like trying to imagine sprouting wings and flying. I looked down at my hands. They were rough, scarred from burns and cuts accumulated over years of kitchen work. My nails were short and uneven, bitten down during moments of stress. These were not the hands of a CEO. These were not the hands of someone who belonged in boardrooms and corner offices. These were the hands of a woman who'd spent her entire life one disaster away from homelessness. How was I supposed to transform into someone else overnight? But maybe that was the point. Maybe I didn't have to transform. Maybe I just had to show up. Sign the papers. Take what was being offered, however insane and undeserved it felt. And figure out the rest later. One step at a time. One day at a time. The same way I'd survived everything else. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the yellow streetlights. Bellmont looked the same as it always did. Tired. Gray. Forgotten. But tomorrow, I'd drive out of here towards something different. Something that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. I didn't know what I'd find in Portland. Didn't know if this inheritance was real or a cruel joke. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done counting coins. Whatever came next, it had to be better than this. It had to be. The drive to Portland took an hour, though it felt both longer and shorter than that. I left Bellmont at 8 in the morning, giving myself extra time in case the Civic decided to stage a final rebellion. The sky had cleared overnight, leaving everything washed clean and bright. The kind of morning that felt like a beginning, though I couldn't decide if it was the start of something wonderful or something I'd regret. I'd spent an hour that morning trying to figure out what to wear. My wardrobe consisted of work uniforms, worn jeans, and a collection of thrift store sweaters that had seen better decades. I'd finally settled on black pants that were slightly too big and a dark green blouse I'd bought for a job interview 3 years ago. It had a small stain near the hem that I'd tried to scrub out without success, but if I kept my jacket on, nobody would see it. I'd washed my hair, blown it dry with the ancient hairdryer that only worked if you held it at a specific angle, and pulled it into a low bun that felt more professional than my usual ponytail. Looking at myself in the cracked mirror, I still looked like someone playing dress-up. Like a child wearing her mother's clothes and hoping nobody would notice. The highway stretched ahead, flanked by evergreens that rose like walls on either side. Traffic was light for a Wednesday morning, mostly delivery trucks and the occasional commuter heading into the city. I kept the radio off, preferring the sound of the engine and the wind rushing past the partially open window. My mind was too loud for music anyway, spinning through scenarios and questions I couldn't answer. What if this was all some elaborate mistake? What if I got to the attorney's office and they realized they'd called the wrong Diane Hartley? What if the inheritance came with conditions I couldn't meet, expectations I couldn't fulfill? Portland emerged gradually, the skyline rising in the distance like a promise or a threat. I'd been to the city maybe a dozen times in my life, mostly for job interviews that went nowhere or medical appointments at the free clinic. It had always felt like foreign territory, a place where people wore clothes that fit and ate at restaurants with menus I couldn't read. The buildings were taller here, cleaner. The streets were lined with trees that had been planted deliberately, not just whatever managed to survive. Even the rain seemed different in Portland, more purposeful somehow, like it knew where it was going. I followed the GPS directions on my phone, watching the battery percentage drop with each passing mile. 40%. I'd forgotten to charge it overnight, too distracted by everything that had happened. The voice guided me through downtown streets crowded with morning traffic, past coffee shops where people sat with laptops, past boutiques that sold things nobody actually needed. The Whitfield and Associates building was in the financial district, a tower of steel and glass that reflected the sky in its windows. I'd walked past it before, years ago, and never thought I'd have reason to go inside. Parking was the first challenge. The building had a garage underneath, but a sign at the entrance warned that it was for tenants and clients only. Was I a client? I supposed I was. I pulled up to the barrier, and a security guard emerged from a booth, leaning down to peer through my window. He looked at my car the way people usually did, taking in the rust and the duct tape holding the side mirror in place and clearly wondering if I was lost. Help you? His tone suggested he already knew I didn't belong here. I have an appointment. Whitfield and Associates. 20th floor. Name? Diane Hartley. He consulted a clipboard, running his finger down a list. Then his expression shifted, just slightly. The skepticism didn't disappear entirely, but it receded. He nodded, pressing a button that raised the barrier. Park anywhere on level 2. Elevators are to your right. I found a spot between a Mercedes and a Tesla, both of which probably cost more than I'd earned in my entire life. The Civic looked like a stray dog that had wandered into a kennel of show breeds. I grabbed my purse, an old canvas bag with a broken zipper, and locked the car. The elevator was glass, offering a view of the parking garage as it ascended. I watched my car shrink below me, feeling like I was leaving something behind. Some version of myself that had driven here in hope and fear, not knowing what she'd find. The lobby on the ground floor was all marble and chrome, the kind of space designed to intimidate. A security desk sat in the center, staffed by 2 guards who barely glanced at me as I walked past toward the main elevator bank. A directory on the wall listed dozens of companies. Law firms, investment advisors, consulting agencies. Whitfield and Associates was listed on floor 20. I pressed the button and waited, watching my reflection in the polished metal doors. I looked small. Out of place. Exactly like what I was. The elevator climbed silently, numbers lighting up in sequence. 5. 10. 15. My stomach lurched with each floor, though I couldn't tell if it was the motion or the nerves. At 20, the doors opened onto a hallway with cream-colored walls and paintings that looked expensive but meaningless. Abstract splashes of color that probably had names like momentum or transcendence. A reception area waited at the end of the hall, all glass and leather furniture. A woman sat behind a curved desk, her hair pulled into a sleek twist, her suit jacket so perfectly tailored it might have been painted on. She looked up as I approached, and I watched her eyes make the same journey the parking guards had. Taking inventory. Making assessments. Coming to conclusions. Can I help you? I'm here to see Leonard Voss. I have a 10 o'clock appointment. Your name? Diane Hartley. Her fingers moved across a keyboard, and her expression went carefully neutral. Of course. Mr. Voss is expecting you. Please have a seat. He'll be right out. I sat on the edge of a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent, trying not to touch anything. The coffee table in front of me held a selection of magazines. Forbes, The Economist, Architectural Digest. I didn't pick any of them up. On the wall across from me hung a series of photographs showing the Portland skyline at different times of day. Dawn, noon, dusk, night. The city transforming but staying fundamentally the same. I wondered if that's what would happen to me. If I'd transform but stay fundamentally the same person underneath. The girl who'd counted coins yesterday morning, just wearing different clothes. Miss Hartley? I looked up to find a man standing in the doorway to the right of the reception desk. He was maybe 50, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a suit that looked comfortable, broken in, like he spent most of his life in it. His expression was kind, which surprised me. I'd expected cold professionalism, the sort of clinical detachment lawyers on television always had. "I'm Leonard Voss. Thank you for coming." I stood, and we shook hands. His grip was firm but not aggressive. "Follow me, please. We'll talk in my office." The hallway beyond the reception area was lined with closed doors, each with a name placard. We passed conference rooms with long tables and ergonomic chairs. Offices with windows overlooking the city. Everything was quiet, insulated. The kind of quiet that money bought. Leonard's office was at the end of the hall, corner view, windows on two sides. The city spread out below us, miniature cars navigating miniature streets, people reduced to dots of color. "Please, sit." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, then settled into his own. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine. Thank you." My voice sounded strange. Too formal. Like I was playing a part in a movie I hadn't auditioned for. Leonard opened a folder on his desk, thick with papers. I could see my name on the tab. Hartley, Diane M. The middle initial stood for Marie, my mother's middle name. The only piece of her I'd inherited besides her hair color and her tendency to apologize for things that weren't her fault. "I'm sure you have questions," Leonard said. "I'll try to answer them as best I can. But first, let me confirm the basics. Your grandfather, Vincent Hartley, passed away on February 8th. He had no surviving spouse and no other living children or grandchildren. His will, executed 2 years ago and updated 6 months ago, names you as the sole beneficiary of his estate. Why?" The question came out harsher than I'd intended. "I'm sorry. I just don't understand. He never met me. Never acknowledged me. My mother died waiting for him to care, and he never did. So why would he leave me anything?" Leonard leaned back in his chair, and I saw something in his expression that looked like sympathy. I asked him that same question when he first came to me about updating his will. He told me he'd spent his life making decisions based on pride and image. Decisions he regretted. He said he couldn't undo what he'd done to your mother, but he could try to give you the life she should have had. That doesn't make sense. He had 2 years after making that will. 6 months after updating it. He could have reached out. Could have met me. Could have apologized. He was dying. Pancreatic cancer. By the time he updated the will 6 months ago, he was already in hospice care. I think he was afraid. Afraid of what? That I'd reject him? That I'd be angry? Leonard nodded slowly. That, yes. But also afraid of what he'd see. You're living proof of every choice he regretted. Every failure. Every moment of cowardice. Meeting you would have meant confronting all of that. It was easier to help from a distance. To write a check and sign papers than to look you in the eye and admit what he'd done. I felt anger rising, hot and bitter. So instead, he just dumped his money on me and expected that to make everything okay? Expected me to be grateful? I don't think he expected anything. I think he hoped you'd have a better life than he gave your mother. That's all. His words, not mine. I looked out the window, blinking back tears I refused to let fall. Below us, the city continued its daily rhythm. People going to work. Making deals. Living lives that had nothing to do with dead men and their guilty consciences. What does the inheritance include? Specifically. Leonard pulled out a document, sliding it across the desk. The estate is substantial. The primary asset is Hartley Industries. Vincent owned 51% of company shares, which transfer to you upon execution of the will. The remaining 49% is distributed among board members and private investors. Additionally, there's his home in the West Hills, a property portfolio including 4 commercial buildings and 2 residential rentals, investment accounts totaling approximately $18 million, and various personal effects. I stared at the numbers on the page, but they might as well have been written in another language. What does owning 51% of the company actually mean? It means you have controlling interest. You're the majority shareholder. Technically, you could walk into Hartley Industries tomorrow and take over operations. Fire the CEO. Restructure the board. Make any decision you want. But I don't know anything about running a company. I work at a diner. Worked, past tense, probably. I didn't show up for my shift yesterday afternoon. You don't have to run the company. Vincent hired competent people to do that. Marcus Caldwell has been CEO for 8 years. The board is experienced. They can continue operations without your direct involvement. You'll receive dividends, attend shareholder meetings if you choose, vote on major decisions. But day-to-day operations can remain as they are. What if they don't want me involved? What if they contest the will? They can't. I've already informed the board of Vincent's death and the terms of his will. There's been some surprise, understandably. But legally, it's airtight. Vincent was of sound mind when he made these decisions. He was very clear about his intentions. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache building behind my eyes. This is insane. Yesterday I was counting change to buy food. Today I'm a millionaire? Multimillionaire, technically. Your total inheritance, including all assets and company valuation, is approximately $360 million. The number hit me like a physical force. I'd heard it yesterday on the phone, but hearing it again in this office with documents and signatures that made it real was different. $360 million. I couldn't comprehend it. Couldn't fit it into any framework I had for understanding the world. It was too big. Too absurd. What happens now? I asked quietly. Leonard pulled out another document. This is the formal acceptance of inheritance. You'll need to sign it. Then we'll begin the process of transferring assets. The house will take a few weeks to fully process. The investment accounts are already in transition. The company's shares will transfer within 10 business days. There are tax implications we'll need to discuss, estate taxes and such, but I have accountants who specialize in that. And if I don't sign? If I walk away? Then the estate goes to the state of Oregon. Everything Vincent built would be liquidated and absorbed into public coffers. Is that what you want? I looked at the document. At the line where my signature would go. At the pen Leonard had placed beside it. No. That's not what I want. But I don't want this either. I don't want money that comes from a man who let my mother die. Who abandoned us. Who only cared when he was facing his own death and needed to feel better about himself. Then take the money and do something good with it. Help people the way you were never helped. Build something your mother would be proud of. Don't let Vincent's guilt be the end of the story. Make it the beginning of yours. I picked up the pen. It was heavy, probably expensive, the kind of pen that was meant to sign important things. My hand was shaking as I brought it to the paper. I thought about my mother, working at that gas station. Thought about my father, drowning himself in bottles and needles because he couldn't live with his grief. Thought about every night I'd gone to bed hungry, every winter I'd slept in my coat, every time I'd had to choose between electricity and food. And I thought about what Leonard had said. Don't let Vincent's guilt be the end of the story. Make it the beginning of yours. I signed my name. Diane Marie Hartley. The ink was dark and permanent, and with each letter, I felt something shift. Some fundamental change in the architecture of my life. When I finished, I set the pen down and looked up at Leonard. What do I do now? He smiled. Whatever you want. That's the point. We spent the next 2 hours going over paperwork. Account numbers. Property deeds. Contact information for the various people who managed Vincent's affairs. Marcus Caldwell at Hartley Industries. The property manager who oversaw the rental buildings. The housekeeper who'd been maintaining Vincent's home since his death. Names and numbers that blurred together until I finally had to ask Leonard to stop. This is too much. I can't process all of this right now. I understand. Take these files home. Read through them at your own pace. Call me anytime you have questions. And Diane? Don't feel like you have to make any major decisions immediately. Take time. Figure out what you want this inheritance to mean for you. I left the office with a briefcase full of documents and a head full of static. The elevator ride down felt different than the ride up. I looked at my reflection in the doors and saw someone unfamiliar. Same face, same clothes, but different somehow. Changed. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and concrete, and my car looked even more pathetic than it had that morning, crouched between the luxury vehicles like it knew it didn't belong. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, briefcase on the passenger seat, hands on the steering wheel. Through the concrete ceiling above me, I could hear the city. Distant traffic. Voices. The ambient hum of a place where life continued regardless of personal earthquakes. I thought about driving back to Bellmont, back to my apartment and my futon and my job at the diner. Thought about pretending this morning had never happened, that I could go back to being the person I'd been yesterday. But that person was gone. The moment I'd signed my name, I'd killed her. And I didn't know yet who I'd become in her place. I started the engine, and the Civic coughed to life. One more time, I thought. Get me home one more time, and then you can rest. We pulled out of the garage into brilliant sunshine, and I pointed us toward the highway, toward Bellmont, toward whatever came next. Behind me, downtown Portland gleamed like a promise I wasn't sure I was ready to keep. The news spread faster than I'd expected. By Thursday afternoon, less than 24 hours after I'd signed the papers in Leonard Voss's office, my phone started ringing with numbers I didn't recognize. Reporters, mostly. Local news outlets sniffing out the story of Vincent Hartley's mystery heir. I didn't answer any of them. Let the calls go to voicemail, listened to the messages once, then deleted them. A woman from the Oregonian wanted an exclusive interview. A producer from a Portland morning show wanted me to come on and share my journey from poverty to wealth. A blogger who specialized in inheritance drama offered to tell my story for a percentage of future earnings. I sat in my apartment surrounded by the files Leonard had given me, trying to make sense of the infrastructure of wealth. It was more complicated than I'd imagined. The investment accounts alone had 37 pages of documentation. Stock portfolios. Bonds. Mutual funds. A Roth IRA that Vincent had apparently been contributing to for 40 years. Numbers that meant nothing to me arranged in columns that might as well have been hieroglyphics. I'd never had enough money to invest. Never had a savings account that held more than a few $100s before some emergency drained it dry. Now I was looking at statements showing balances with so many zeros I had to count them twice to believe they were real. The properties were easier to understand, at least conceptually. 4 commercial buildings, all in Portland. 2 were leased to tech companies. 1 housed a law firm, ironically enough. The 4th was a mixed-use development with retail on the ground floor and offices above. Then there were the residential rentals. A duplex in southeast Portland that brought in $3,200 a month. A small house in Beaverton that rented for $1,900. Income I'd done nothing to earn, generated by assets I hadn't known existed until yesterday. And then there was the house. Vincent's house. The primary residence, as the paperwork called it. It sat in the West Hills, one of Portland's most expensive neighborhoods, on 2 acres of land with views of the city and Mount Hood. The property assessment valued it at $4.2 million. $4.2 million for a single house. I'd lived my entire life in spaces that cost less than a used car, and now I owned a house worth more than most people would earn in 50 lifetimes. Krista showed up Friday evening without calling first, letting herself in with the key I'd given her years ago when we'd been roommates. She found me on the floor, surrounded by paper, wearing the same clothes I'd had on since Wednesday. I looked up when she came in, and whatever she saw on my face made her stop in the doorway. Jesus, Diane. When's the last time you ate? I don't know. Yesterday? This morning? Time felt slippery, unanchored. I'd been reading documents for so long that reality had taken on a dreamlike quality. She disappeared into the kitchen, and I heard her rummaging through cabinets that held nothing but expired condiments and a box of stale crackers. 5 minutes later, she was pulling me off the floor and shoving a granola bar into my hand. Eat. Then tell me what's happening. Because you look like someone who just found out the world is ending, not someone who just became disgustingly rich. I ate the granola bar mechanically, tasting nothing. It's real. All of it. The money, the company, the properties. I signed papers on Wednesday, and now it's all mine. That's good, right? That's what you wanted? I don't know what I wanted. I didn't want any of this. I just wanted to not be poor anymore. There's a difference between those things that I'm only now starting to understand. Krista sat down on the futon, pushing aside a stack of documents about dividend distributions. Okay. Walk me through it. What exactly did you inherit? I spent 20 minutes explaining, watching her eyes get wider with each detail. The company shares. The investment accounts. The properties. The house in the West Hills that I hadn't even seen yet but apparently now owned. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You know what the craziest part is? She finally said. 2 weeks ago, we were talking about going in on a $20 pizza because neither of us could afford one alone. And now you could buy the entire restaurant. Don't. I felt something twist in my chest. Don't do that. Don't make it about what I can buy now. Because I don't know how to think about that yet. I'm sorry. You're right. She reached over and squeezed my hand. How are you really doing with all this? Terrified. Overwhelmed. Angry. I looked at the papers scattered around us. He had all this. 4 decades. While my mom was dying because she couldn't afford a doctor. While I was eating cereal for dinner because that's all we had. He had millions, and he let us suffer. And now he thinks he can fix it by dumping it all on me after he's dead? Maybe he didn't think it would fix anything. Maybe he just wanted you to have what should have been yours all along. Or maybe he wanted to ease his conscience before he died. Make himself feel better about being a terrible person. Either way, I'm left holding all of this and I don't know what to do with it. Krista stood up, pulling me to my feet. First thing you're going to do is take a shower. Then you're going to eat real food. Then we're going to figure this out together, one piece at a time. But you can't do any of that sitting on the floor drowning in paperwork. She was right. I showered, letting the hot water run until it turned lukewarm, then cold. Put on clean clothes that felt strange against my skin, like they belonged to someone else. Krista had ordered Thai food, and we ate it sitting on the futon, not talking about inheritance or money or dead grandfathers. Just eating and existing in a moment that felt almost normal. After she left, I did something I'd been avoiding. I called the number for Marcus Caldwell, the CEO of Hartley Industries. It went to voicemail, his voice smooth and professional. You've reached Marcus Caldwell. Please leave a message. I hung up without speaking, then immediately felt stupid. He was expecting my call. Leonard had told him about the inheritance. I was the majority shareholder now, whether I felt ready for that title or not. I tried again. This time, when the beep sounded, I forced words out. Mr. Caldwell, this is Diane Hartley. Vincent's granddaughter. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the company. Please call me back when you have time. I left my number and hung up, heart pounding like I'd just done something dangerous. He called back within 10 minutes. Ms. Hartley. I was hoping to hear from you. His voice was different than it had been on the voicemail. More cautious, testing the waters. I want to express my condolences for your grandfather's passing. Vincent was an extraordinary man. I didn't know him. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. Sorry. That sounded harsh. I just mean that we never met. I'm aware. Leonard Voss briefed me on the situation. I understand this must be overwhelming for you. That's one word for it. I took a breath, trying to steady myself. I'd like to tour the facility. Meet the staff. Understand what I've inherited. Of course. Would Monday work for you? Say 10 in the morning? I can give you a comprehensive overview of operations. Monday. That gave me the weekend to prepare, whatever preparation meant in this context. Monday works. Excellent. I'll have my assistant send you the address and parking information. And Ms. Hartley? I look forward to meeting you. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone. Monday. In 3 days, I'd walk into Hartley Industries as the majority shareholder. The owner, essentially, even if I had no idea what that actually meant. I'd meet people who'd worked for Vincent for years, decades maybe. People who'd known him as a boss, a colleague, possibly even a friend. And I'd have to stand there and pretend I belonged, pretend I had any right to inherit what they'd helped build. The weekend passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. I researched the company obsessively, reading every article I could find. Hartley Industries specialized in precision manufacturing, producing components for aerospace, medical devices, and telecommunications equipment. 843 employees across 3 locations. Annual revenue last year had been $267 million. Profit margins in the 18% range, which apparently was good for manufacturing. Vincent had founded it in 1987 with a small team and a contract to produce specialized fasteners for Boeing. It had grown from there, expanding into new markets, acquiring smaller competitors, building a reputation for quality and reliability. I learned the names of the board members. Marcus Caldwell, the CEO, who'd started as a production manager 15 years ago and worked his way up. Paige Whitmore, VP of Operations, who'd been with the company for 12 years. Robert Chen, Chief Financial Officer, who'd joined 6 years ago from a firm in Seattle. There were others, but those 3 seemed to be the core leadership. The people who actually ran things while Vincent had gradually stepped back over the last decade of his life. Sunday night, I couldn't sleep. Lay on the futon staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to Mrs. Kowalski's television bleeding through the walls. Some nature documentary, the narrator's voice rising and falling in rhythms that should have been soothing but only amplified my restlessness. I kept thinking about my mother. Wondering what she'd think if she could see me now. Would she be happy? Angry that it had taken Vincent dying to give me what should have been hers? Would she tell me to take the money and run, or would she want me to honor the company her father had built? I didn't have answers. Just questions that multiplied like bacteria in a petri dish. Monday morning arrived cold and bright. I'd bought new clothes on Saturday, spending money that still felt imaginary even though I'd used a credit card Leonard had arranged for me, linked to one of the investment accounts. A navy suit that the saleswoman had insisted was perfect for business meetings. Low heels that pinched my feet but looked professional. I'd gotten my hair cut and styled at a salon that cost more than I used to make in a week. Looking at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked competent. Put together. Nothing like the person who'd been counting coins on a kitchen counter 6 days ago. The Hartley Industries facility was in an industrial park on the outskirts of Portland, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by parking lots and loading docks. The main building was modern, all glass and steel, with the company logo mounted prominently above the entrance. A sculpture stood in front, abstract metal shapes that might have represented precision or innovation or nothing at all. I parked in a visitor spot and sat in my car for 5 minutes, breathing deeply and trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. You can do this, I told myself. You don't have to know everything. You just have to show up. Be polite. Listen. Learn. The rest will come. The lobby was impressive. High ceilings. Polished concrete floors. A reception desk where a young woman with perfect posture looked up as I entered. Good morning. How can I help you? I'm Diane Hartley. I have an appointment with Marcus Caldwell. Her smile shifted, became more genuine. Welcome, Ms. Hartley. Mr. Caldwell is expecting you. Please have a seat. He'll be down shortly. I sat in a chair that was probably designed to look modern and edgy but mostly just felt uncomfortable. The walls displayed photos of products Hartley Industries had manufactured. Tiny intricate components that went into satellites and medical devices. Precision work that required skill and expertise I couldn't begin to understand. On a wall to my left hung a timeline of the company's history. 1987, Vincent Hartley founds the company with 3 employees. 1992, first major aerospace contract. 1998, expansion into medical device manufacturing. 2004, acquisition of Precision Tech Solutions. On and on, milestones and achievements that represented decades of work. And nowhere on that wall was there any mention of Claire Hartley, Vincent's daughter. My mother. The woman he'd erased from his life so completely that even the history of his company pretended she'd never existed. Miss Hartley? I looked up to find a man approaching. He was in his mid-40s, tall and fit in a way that suggested either good genes or regular gym membership. His suit was expensive but not showy. Dark hair graying at the temples. Warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Marcus Caldwell. He extended his hand. Welcome. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. His handshake was firm but not aggressive. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Nonsense. You own 51% of this company. Seeing you isn't a favor, it's my job. He gestured toward a hallway. Shall we start with a tour? I can show you the facility, introduce you to some key people, then we'll sit down and discuss the business in detail. That sounds perfect. We walked through hallways lined with awards and certifications. ISO standards. Safety recognitions. Excellence awards from various industry organizations. Marcus narrated as we went, pointing out departments and explaining their functions. Engineering worked on this floor. Quality control and testing in the building adjacent. The production floor where the actual manufacturing happened was the largest space, a vast room filled with machinery and people in safety gear. He introduced me to supervisors and managers, each one polite but clearly uncertain about who I was and what my presence meant. This is Diane Hartley, Marcus would say. Vincent's granddaughter. And I'd shake hands and smile and try not to see the questions in their eyes. Where had I been all these years? Why had Vincent never mentioned me? What did I know about manufacturing? The tour took 2 hours. By the end, my feet ached in the new shoes and my face hurt from maintaining a pleasant expression. We ended in Marcus's office, a spacious room with windows overlooking the production floor. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. Coffee? Water? Water would be great. He poured from a pitcher, handed me a glass, then settled into his own chair. So. I imagine you have questions. About 1,000. But let's start with the most important one. How did Vincent run this company? What was his management style? Marcus considered the question carefully. Vincent was hands-on for many years. He knew every aspect of the business, made most major decisions himself. But over the last decade, especially after Patricia died, he started delegating more. He trusted his leadership team. Made us responsible for day-to-day operations while he focused on strategy and long-term vision. By the time he entered hospice, he'd essentially stepped back entirely. We've been running things without him for the better part of a year. And the company is doing well? Financially stable? Very. We have strong contracts, healthy profit margins, low debt. Vincent was conservative with expansion, always made sure we had reserves. We're in excellent shape. I took a sip of water, trying to organize my thoughts. I need to be honest with you, Mr. Caldwell. I don't know anything about running a company. I barely know anything about business. A week ago, I was waiting tables at a diner. I'm not qualified to make decisions about manufacturing or contracts or any of this. With respect, Ms. Hartley, Vincent wasn't looking for someone qualified when he made you his heir. He was looking for family. Someone who could inherit what he'd built and decide what to do with it. And what if I decide to sell? What if I take the money and walk away? Something flickered in Marcus's expression. Concern, maybe, or disappointment. That's your right as majority shareholder. But it would be a shame. This company employs 800 people. Supports families. Does good work. Vincent built something meaningful here. It would be a loss if it was broken up and sold for parts. I'm not saying that's what I want. I'm just trying to understand my options. Your options are essentially unlimited. You can stay involved or remain hands-off. You can vote on major decisions or trust the board to handle them. You can visit once a month or never set foot here again. The company will continue either way. We have systems in place, experienced people. Your ownership doesn't require your participation. But it would help if I participated. If I learned the business. If I became someone who could actually contribute rather than just collecting dividends. Marcus smiled. Yes. It would help. But only if that's something you genuinely want. This can't be an obligation. It has to be a choice. I looked out the window at the production floor below. People in safety vests moving between machines. Conveyor belts carrying parts to different stations. A choreography of industry I didn't understand but could appreciate. All of it continuing because Vincent had started something 40 years ago and hired people smart enough to keep it going. I want to learn, I said finally. I don't know if I'll be any good at this. Don't know if I have whatever it takes to be a business owner. But I want to try. For my mother, if nothing else. For the life she should have had. Marcus nodded slowly. Then we'll teach you. Whatever you need to know, we'll make sure you learn it. Welcome to Hartley Industries, Ms. Hartley. I think you're going to do just fine. I wished I shared his confidence. But as I left his office and walked back through those hallways lined with achievement and history, I felt something shifting inside me. Not certainty. Not even hope, really. But possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, I could become someone who belonged in this world Vincent had built. Someone who could honor the inheritance not by running from it, but by growing into it. One day at a time. One decision at a time. The same way I'd survived everything else. 3 months passed like water through a sieve. Fast and disorienting, carrying away the person I'd been and leaving someone new in her place. I moved out of the Maple Grove apartment on a Saturday in May, Krista helping me pack the few possessions worth keeping. The futon stayed behind. The card table. The mini fridge that had never worked properly. I took my clothes, a box of photos, and the cracked mirror from the bathroom because somehow it felt important to remember what I'd looked like when I had nothing. The house in the West Hills was too big for one person. 16 rooms spread across 4 levels, each one decorated in the tasteful neutral tones that wealthy people seemed to prefer. I walked through it that first night feeling like an intruder, afraid to touch anything, sleeping in the smallest bedroom because the master suite felt like a museum. But gradually, I made it mine. Filled the kitchen with food that didn't come from discount bins. Bought furniture that actually fit my body instead of whatever someone else had discarded. Planted flowers in the garden that overlooked the city, watching them grow alongside my own tentative roots. Hartley Industries became my education. Marcus assigned me a mentor, an operations manager named Helen Rodriguez who'd worked her way up from the production floor over 20 years. She taught me to read balance sheets and profit-loss statements. Walked me through contract negotiations and supply chain logistics. Introduced me to the rhythms of manufacturing, the constant balance between efficiency and quality, speed and precision. I spent mornings in meetings and afternoons on the production floor, learning the names of machines and the people who operated them. The board meetings were the hardest. Sitting at that long table surrounded by people with decades of experience while I struggled to understand half the terminology they used. But I showed up. Asked questions when I didn't understand. Listened more than I spoke. And slowly, grudgingly, they began to accept me. Not as Vincent's replacement, but as something different. Someone learning. Someone trying. Paige Whitmore was the last holdout. She'd been Vincent's right hand for years, and my presence clearly felt like a betrayal of his memory. We clashed in a board meeting in July over a proposed expansion into European markets. She wanted to move aggressively. I thought we should wait, study the market more carefully. The argument got heated, voices rising, other board members exchanging uncomfortable glances. After the meeting, she cornered me in the hallway. "You don't know what you're doing. You're going to ruin everything Vincent built." "Maybe." I met her eyes steadily. "Or maybe I'll build something different. Something better. But either way, I'm here. I'm learning. And I'm not going anywhere." She stared at me for a long moment, then something in her expression shifted. "You sound like your mother. Vincent showed me a picture once, years ago. When he'd had too much to drink and got melancholy. He said she had the same stubbornness. The same fire." My throat tightened. "He talked about her?" "Once. Just once. He said she was the bravest person he'd ever known, and he destroyed her because he was a coward. Then he put the picture away and never mentioned her again. I found that picture later, going through boxes in Vincent's study. My mother at 19, leaning against a car, laughing at something outside the frame. She looked happy. Unburdened. Not yet ground down by single parenthood and poverty and a father who'd turned his back on her. I had it framed and hung it in my office at Hartley Industries, a reminder of why I was doing this. Not for Vincent. For her. For the life she should have had. The diner closed in August. Gary finally gave up after 30 years of struggling. I heard about it from Krista and felt a strange grief, even though I'd never gone back after that Tuesday morning when everything changed. I drove to Bellmont one last time, parked across the street from the dark building with its faded sign. Riverside Diner, missing the E, inside those walls. I'd spent 3 years pouring coffee and taking orders and dreaming of something better without believing it would ever come. I thought about buying the building. Reopening it as something else. But that felt like trying to preserve a past that needed to stay buried. Instead, I donated money to a Bellmont community fund, enough to help families like mine had been. People counting coins. People choosing between medicine and rent. People who needed someone to see them and care. It wouldn't fix everything. Wouldn't undo the years I'd suffered or bring back the people I'd lost. But it was something. A small redistribution of wealth that should have been shared decades ago. By October, I'd stopped feeling like an imposter. Stopped waiting for someone to realize I didn't belong and send me back to where I'd come from. The company was thriving. We'd landed 2 major contracts. Hired 50 new employees. I'd voted on acquisitions and expansion strategies, and my votes had mattered. Not because I was the smartest person in the room, but because I'd learned to ask the right questions and trust people who knew more than I did. Krista came to the house for dinner one evening, bringing wine and the easy comfort of someone who'd known me before. We sat on the back terrace watching the sun set over Portland, the city lights beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. "You did it," she said quietly. "You actually did it." Did what? Survived. Became someone new. Built a life. I thought about that. About the girl counting coins. About the woman signing papers in Leonard Voss's office, terrified and uncertain. About all the versions of myself scattered across the months between then and now. I didn't become someone new. I became who I always was underneath. I just finally had the space to figure out who that person could be. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the garden. Roses and lavender. Growing things. Living things. Somewhere in the city below, people were counting coins and wondering if they'd make it through the week. Somewhere, someone was getting a phone call that would change everything. Life was strange that way. Cruel and kind in equal measure, devastating and miraculous, often in the same breath. I couldn't fix everyone's problems. Couldn't undo every injustice or right every wrong. But I could honor the inheritance by becoming someone worthy of it. Not through blood or birthright, but through choice. Through showing up every day and trying to build something my mother would recognize. Something that looked less like Vincent's redemption and more like my own becoming. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and the city glowed brighter in its absence. Tomorrow, I'd go back to Hartley Industries. Back to meetings and decisions and the constant work of learning. But tonight, I sat in the garden I'd planted and let myself feel something I'd never expected to feel. Gratitude. Not for Vincent or his guilt-driven generosity, but for the chance to transform pain into purpose. To take what had been withheld and use it to build something better. I was enough. I'd always been enough. I just finally had the resources to prove it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.